In my constituency, we see a huge challenge with 1 in 2 children living in poverty after housing costs are taken into account. And in London, we know that 60% of households in poverty are working households. That's an increase from 44% only a few years ago. And it's a reflection of the low pay that too many workers are paid and the high housing costs in constituencies like mine. So we all know that employment is a huge opportunity, but it is not a route out of poverty on its own for many people in London because of these high living costs. And that cost of living crisis is not just hitting those in constituencies like mine with those high prices, but biting everybody, biting now those who are just about managing, those who are on good incomes, but hitting huge increases to their fuel bills. And we know the government's response to that has been, from the Klarna Chancellor, lend the money now and people have to pay it back later, further indebting particularly the poorest households. So we need much better support for those left behind. And the government talks about levelling up. But in Hackney, we don't see much of this levelling up fund. We are the 7th most deprived local authority area in the country. But in the government's approach to levelling up, Hackney, and yet constituencies like Richmondshire, Derbyshire Dales and High Peak, which are respectively the 256th, the 265th and the 202nd most deprived constituencies in the country, are being prioritised over those children in my constituency living in poverty, living in overcrowded conditions, too often, sharing a bed with a parent up to the age of early teens because there is nowhere else for them to sleep, and struggling because of the challenges of the pandemic. They need support, and we must make sure, and this government needs to hear, that levelling up isn't just about levelling up in between different regions of the UK, but in parts of London within our amazing capital city. And of all people, the Prime Minister, who had the honour of serving as the elected Mayor of London, should be aware of that, and it is a shame on him that he is not tackling this head on. We need much better support, Mr. Speaker, for housing generally. I have more private renters in my constituency than I have homeowners, and more social housing tenants than both of those combined, and all have real problems. And the government is finally unveiling its renters reform bill, something that we're all keen to see, but just abolishing no-fault evictions isn't enough to solve the challenges of where people can live. You cannot live now in the private sector and grow a family, because even with no-fault evictions being abolished, if that does eventually happen, it doesn't make it a stable home, with rents escalating at the whim of the landlord. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Very grateful, Mr. Speaker. Doesn't she understand, though, that this gracious speech is all about levelling up and giving people more opportunity, and there needs to be a surge of private investment into these places with better paid jobs and better skills training and better education? That is the whole point of it, and will she support that?
Well, Mr. Speaker, if that's the whole point of it, forgive me, but I can't see that. I have the privilege of chairing the Public Accounts Committee, where we have looked at the Towns Fund and the levelling up approach. And it is a chaotic policy. It is a headline without proper detail and analysis about how to deliver this. Only the Bristol area has seen economic growth outside London over many decades now. It is a challenge for every government, but the idea that headlines saying it's going to happen are actually going to deliver is just for the birds. And we see this huge increase in private renters, and yet no real support for them. Where is the security? If you cannot afford to buy your own home, and you cannot qualify for social rented housing, which in my constituency is in massively short supply in any case, with hundreds, thousands of families living in massively overcrowded conditions. We've all been on the doorsteps a lot in the last week, Mr. Speaker, and it's a privilege to always meet constituents. But when you keep meeting constituents who you knew when their children were toddlers, whose children are still living, sharing the bedroom, 2 or 3 of them, while their parents live in the living room, and those children are now young adults, it's not good enough. There is no hope for those people, because the government and these proposed bills do nothing to enable councils to build that important social rented housing, give better rights to renters, and provide a proper stepladder to purchasing your own home. Every policy so far has fuelled the equity in those who already own their home, rather than giving a real leg up to wannabe first-time buyers in constituencies like mine, where a 2-bedroom modern flat, as I've said repeatedly in this House, Mr. Speaker, but I repeat it again, on the market for around £750,000. That's just for a 2-bedroom leasehold flat. And as of June of last year, the median house price in the constituency was £600,000. But there aren't many. I'd be struggling to find a property for that price in many parts of my constituency. But that's a huge increase, 9.1% over the past 5 years. A house in Hackney costs more than 16 times the average Hackney salary. And that's not, and you know, Hackney has a range of salaries, though there are a lot of people at the poorer end. And 1 in 35 people in my constituency are recorded officially as homeless or in temporary accommodation. But that doesn't include those overcrowded ones, those who are overcrowded because there's no space for them to go, and those with no recourse to public funds who can't possibly afford to rent privately, even though they're working, and certainly could never buy. And rents, as we all know, are very, very high. So we need much better support, and there's no real solution in this Queen's speech. And crucially, we need real support for a lost generation. Many people have been very badly affected by COVID. But a group that I worry about particularly are our children, who have lost out on 2 years of education. And hats off to the teachers and schools that kept educating them. But for many children, however well the school did, if you didn't have the technology at home, you were clustered around one computer and a mobile phone with poor data, that was never going to be the same as a classroom experience. So schools did the best they could, and many did a very, very good job. But there is a challenge for children who lost out on education, who will go through the system without catching up under the government's proposal. So I look forward to seeing what's in their bill. But realistically, and I've been talking to my schools about the cost of their energy bills as just one recent crisis. And the cost increase on their energy bills mean the choice between heating the school or losing a teacher. So having our children freeze in a classroom but being taught by a teacher, or a warm school where they can concentrate on learning but losing that crucial classroom teacher. That's the stark reality, and I'm happy to share with anybody in the government the figures from the schools that have provided it to me if we can work together for a solution on that. But the cost of catch-up is a cost that is absolutely vital we pay. It is taxpayers' money well spent to invest in the generation that will be the engine of our future, that will be the entrepreneurs. Because my constituency may be poor, but it has no poverty of aspiration. But unless we give those children the leg up now and the catch up now, they will not get the advantages that they should have. And we've seen the complete failure of the tutoring scheme, which my cross-party committee highlighted as a concern very early on. We said, where are these tutors that are going to go in and tutor? And of course, that contract has been axed. So we still need a lot of support. We're seeing children in years 7 and 8, according to teachers in my constituency, having to be taught how to do decent handwriting because they missed those crucial years at primary school. Pupils in years 7 and 8 losing out in some areas because the qualified teachers are focused on the exam years. And we all want our children to succeed, and the government needs to make sure that school funding is properly resolved. It's fallen in average terms, in real terms, per pupil by 1.2% for the most deprived fifths of schools, but increased by nearly 3% for the least deprived fifths of schools. Is this levelling up? It doesn't look like it to me. And the Prime Minister purports to be an intelligent man. I'm sure he can do the maths and work out that that means there's an awful lot of children losing out. I was pleased to see that the Victims Bill is finally, perhaps going to appear. It's only been in 3 manifestos and 4 Queen's speeches. But this is a real crucial problem. Again, my committee has looked at the backlog in the criminal courts. There are many factors to that, some of which cannot be resolved through legislation. The sheer grind of day-to-day delivery and government of decent public services is something that seems alien to the Prime Minister and his front bench. But that aside, we need this Victims Bill to support victims better. Like the woman in my constituency, violently attacked by her partner in front of her 7-year-old daughter. She went to the police. The court case was set for 2 years after that violent attack. It is no surprise that he has repeatedly broken his non-molestation order because he feels that he can get away with it scot-free. And this is happening to victims up and down the country. And for those particularly in that kind of domestic abuse situation, she has said to me, I just want to move, I want a shot of this. I don't want to be reliving this, nor do I want my daughter to relive this over the next 2 years. And if the Victims' Bill is to mean anything in terms of domestic violence, it needs decent options on alternative housing for those who are victims, because that's so often the break that those people need, and they cannot get it. In my constituency, with such a shortage of housing, that is a huge and ongoing issue. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
To the shortage of housing, and we need to get more houses delivered. So will she be supporting the reforms to the planning system that have been incorporated in today's Queen's speech?
Mr. Speaker, I will support anything that delivers the housing. I haven't had a chance to look at the detail. I think we do not yet know all of the detail. But absolutely, in my constituency, if there's a bit of land and nothing's moving on it, we are looking at it as an option for housing. But we cannot fit everything into an inner-city London borough. We need a better balance of housing, but we do definitely need that more affordable housing. And in a constituency like mine, we need more socially rented housing because the other options are not real options for people. People who've been housed in temporary accommodation in other boroughs outside of my constituency often want to move back. When they're on a 5-year lease, I say to them that is, at the moment, the current situation, thanks to this government, often the best you'll get. But when the rent is as high as it is in the private sector, they worry because they cannot survive without some benefit top-up if it fits in with the housing benefit cap. And so they are stuck in a terrible cycle of never being able to have a permanent home. I just wanted to touch on a couple of other issues that have been raised in a lengthy Queen's speech. The Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, talks about Brexit being done. Well, Prime Minister, you know and I know that it's not done, is it? It's far from done. And there is going to be a very long tail of changes that have been repeatedly delayed. There was no planning after the vote in 2016. We've seen import controls once again delayed, and it's not even clear what will change. Businesses are confused, people are confused, and that lack of planning is coming home to roost. So you can use the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, can use the slogans, but we can see through them, and he can have a peruse any day he wants of the committee reports that we've put out there highlighting these concerns. And the Queen's speech has got its whole chunk of dividing issues, issues that the Prime Minister would love me to engage with now, but I'm not going to give him that satisfaction because I want real results for the people in my constituency, not the flim-flam and the cheap headlines of things that he hopes will start culture wars between members of this House and our voters, because everybody in this House and all our constituents know that the cost of living has to be a priority, that levelling up has to be a priority. I was pleased to see a UK infrastructure bank announced, Mr. Speaker, but I'm a bit puzzled because this is the same government that created the Green Investment Bank and then a few years later sold it off to the private sector. So if this infrastructure bank is going to invest in green technologies, well, good, if it works, but why have we had a decade of wasted time on that opportunity? In summary, Mr. Speaker, this bill is not about bringing our country together and supporting people who need it. It's about division. Our Prime Minister has his head in the sand about real life and the real challenges of the cost of living and finding a home for so many of our constituents. There is no direction from this government that's flailing around trying to come up with a list of headlines but unable to competently govern this country in the interests of the people I represent.
Honourable Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I refer members to my entry in the Members' Register. It is indeed a privilege to be able to speak in this debate on the humble address in Her Majesty's Platinum Jubilee year. And as others have already spoken, everybody across this House, including myself, wishes Her Majesty all the very best and thanks her for her unstinting service and her exemplary devotion to duty. As others have done, I would also like to recognise the passing of 3 excellent members of this House, Sir David Amess, James Brokenshire and Jack Dromey. They all came into this House in order to make a difference, to improve people's lives, and they worked unstintingly to do just that. And I would like to congratulate my honourable friends and members for Beverley and Holderness and Brecon and Radnorshire for their absolutely excellent speeches in proposing and seconding this greatest speech of the humble address. I want to speak about a few of the elements of the government's programme that I very much welcome. The Modern Slavery Bill will cement the government's commitment to enhance the provisions on supply chains. I understand the first element will be an extension of the requirements on supply chains to public procurement, to government departments. This is important. In 2019, as Prime Minister, I committed the government to use its power of public procurement to actually ensure that it was cleaning up supply chains and cracking down on modern slavery. I genuinely believe that dealing with supply chains is one of the key ways in which we can ensure that we eradicate modern slavery. Business has a huge role to play here, so does government. Section 54 was important in the Modern Slavery Act, but of course it doesn't actually require action other than putting something in an account, in your report and accounts, which might be to say that you've done nothing about modern slavery. So it is excellent that the government is now moving this forward and going to enhance this legislation. I think it could be transformative. I also want to welcome the Social Housing Regulation Bill. One of the clear messages that came from residents and survivors of the terrible tragedy that was the fire at Grenfell Tower was the concern that for not just months but for years, the voice of residents in social housing had not been heard, had not been listened to by those in authority who had responsibility to respond. This was something that we then discovered from consultation across the country was not unique to Grenfell Tower, but sadly there were too many occasions where those responsible for social housing were simply not listening to the points that their tenants were raising. So it is important that we enhance the ability of tenants to have their voice raised, enhance the regulation regime, and ensure that we can do something which is so important in this country, which is to raise the value for people of social housing. So the stigma is not attached to social housing and being in social housing. We're all one community. The type of housing we live in should be irrelevant to how we are treated. And important here also is the Renters Reform Bill. I note the briefing says that it will provide 4.4 million households with more secure and higher quality homes. Renting is the only option for more and more people, and for some it is the flexible option that they actively want. But it isn't easy if you then live feeling that you could be evicted through no fault of your own. And dealing with those no-fault evictions was a commitment that has been made previously. I seem to remember my government made it, and I sincerely hope that it will now be enacted through this bill. When it comes to housing, it is important for the government to recognise the many concerns that were expressed by the public and by members of this House, across the House, on the elements of the planning white paper that the government published. And I understand that the Housing Secretary has heard those messages and is looking carefully at what should be in the planning bill. We do need more homes. We need to ensure they're in the right place. We need to ensure they're in designs that are actually in keeping with the community and the neighbourhood in which they are set. I believe the Housing Secretary is interested in these street votes, so that if in a street somebody wants to extend their house by 2 floors, they can have a vote in the street and the street will decide whether that's a sensible thing to do. Can I simply say to my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister and others on the front bench, that I think the government needs to be very careful about the potential unintended consequences of such a move. I can well imagine a situation in which somebody persuades their neighbours in the street to agree to sorts of development that might enhance the value of their houses, but actually has a negative impact on the wider community and the wider neighbourhood. Looking at the issues of planning, and this ties in with the energy bill and issues in relation to the energy bill, I do wish the government, hope that the government, I urge them to take the opportunity to move ahead in relation to building regulations, to ensure that we embrace now the standards that will be required for our reaching net zero. We are still seeing new homes being built with gas boilers, and those are going to be retrofitted in a few years' time. And so wouldn't it make more sense to actually make sure that the regulations ensure that we actually do take the moves now for net zero? But I welcome the energy bill, and there is much in there that will help us to move to net zero, and that is excellent. I also welcome the national security bill, which I expect will enhance our ability to deal with threats from hostile states. That is very important, it's increasingly necessary, and it is very timely. In relation to Northern Ireland, there is reference in the Queen's speech to the legacy bill. I think it is important, I've said it before in this House, that we reach a point where there is an ability to try to draw a line on the past, but that must be done sensitively in recognition of the sensitivities of all communities. I note there is no... I will give way to...
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I think there's an explanation needed. I was at the Nigerian embassy getting my pass so that I can go to Nigeria at the end of May. Can I ask the Honourable Lady, it's really important for my constituents, those who have lost loved ones. I can name in the Ballydugan 4, Stuart Montgomery, murdered by the IRA. Nobody ever made accountable. My cousin, nobody ever made accountable. I want justice. My relatives want justice. My constituents want justice. Does the Honourable Lady agree?
Can I say
Theresa May.
I say to the honourable gentleman, we welcome him back to his place in the chamber. That is why I say it is important that these issues are addressed sensitively. They have consistently been looked at by some of my colleagues in relation to those veterans who may find themselves being caught before justice. But what is important is that people who did lose loved ones during the Troubles, and the majority of those losses will have been at the hands of terrorists, but who did lose loved ones during the Troubles, are able to feel that sense of, first of all, actually understanding what has happened and being able to know what has happened. And I think this is one of the things that is driving the government's intention in relation to this bill. And they will want to be able to feel some sense of closure, which they have not been able to see for so many years. I note that there is no reference to what has been referred to in the papers as a bill in relation to, and I'm going to use the word, the Northern Ireland Protocol, and possibly to varying the terms of the treaty unilaterally. Can I say to my right honourable friend, and he will not be surprised if I say this, that I do not feel that that would be the right move for the government, that I think the government needs to consider not just some immediate issues, but also the wider sense of what such a move would say about the United Kingdom and its willingness to abide by treaties which it has signed. I will give way to the right honourable.
I thank the former Prime Minister for giving way. Can I say to her, with great respect that I hold her in, that surely what is more important here is the Good Friday Belfast Agreement and the need to protect the political institutions. I stood in the election last week. Not a single unionist member was returned to the Assembly that supports the protocol. There is no consensus for this. It needs to be dealt with. It is harming our economy. It is driving up the cost of living. It is undermining political stability in Northern Ireland. It threatens the Good Friday Agreement. It has to be dealt with.
Say to the right honourable gentleman that I put a deal before this House which actually met the requirements of the Good Friday Agreement and actually enabled us not to have a border down the Irish Sea or to have a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Sadly, the DUP and others across this House chose to reject that, but it was just such an opportunity for what he wanted. Can I say to my right honourable friend that I am deeply disappointed that we only see draft legislation on a new Mental Health Act. The process for a new Mental Health Act was started in 2017. I've said once before in debate on a previous Queen's speech, that I feared that we might not see a new Act until 2023. I now fear we might not see a new Act until 2024. And, given the proximity of potential general election, may not see a new Act in this Parliament at all. I have to say that I think those suffering from mental health deserve better from the government, and I would encourage action on introducing a new Mental Health Act. I'm also disappointed we don't have an employment bill, particularly to put through the policy of ensuring that tips that are left for waiters actually get paid to those individuals. It was a popular policy, and I would hope that the government will think again on putting it through. The final issue on which I'm disappointed is that we don't see a commitment to an independent public advocate. This was a 2017 manifesto commitment. I recognise my right honourable friend did not put it in the 2019 manifesto, but it was one of the key recommendations from the report I commissioned from Bishop James Jones. 33 years on from the Hillsborough disaster, I think it is time that we actually took action to provide much greater support for those families who lose loved ones in public disasters, and there have been other disasters since Hillsborough. I think it would be a very fitting legacy for those who sadly have lost the front bench. The government doesn't need to do any work on it because the honourable member for Garston and Halewood actually has a bill that is written and which I'm sure she will be aiming to introduce in this House and which could be supported. Now, my final comment is underlying the government's programme is the desire to level up the economy and encourage high-wage, high-skill jobs. A country that works for everyone is about levelling up opportunity across the country. But the economic background against which the government is working does not make delivering on those aspirations easy. The cost of living crisis is making life difficult for many across the country. We have rising inflation, the need to restore public finances, the number of people who are economically inactive in this country is rising, as well as we've seen a hit to sterling, and forecast growth is well below trend. All those make for a very challenging environment. And it's a time like this that the Conservative principles of sound public finances and competent economic management are needed more than ever. And as we level up across the country, we should ensure that we're a government that doesn't just work for certain parts of a country, but a government that truly works for everyone.
Thanks. It's always been a great pleasure to follow the right honourable lady, especially since the current Prime Minister entered office. And I agreed with a lot of what she said, especially on the need to move ahead quickly with new legislation for people with mental health issues, and what she said on social housing, and I thank her for that. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to pay tribute to Her Majesty the Queen. She was missed today very much, and on behalf of the Liberal Democrats, I would like to send her our very best wishes. And we all look forward to celebrating the incredible milestone of the Queen's Platinum Jubilee next month. As an MP serving the Royal Borough of Kingston-upon-Thames, I know there'll be street parties galore across my constituency, demonstrating our patriotic and affectionate support for Her Majesty. I'd also like to pay tribute to three others whose absence we feel very acutely today: James Brokenshire, David Amos and Jack Dromey. Parliamentary colleagues who sadly left us in the last 12 months. All three were MPs who command respect across the House. Respect for their seriousness of purpose and their collegiate way of working. They are all missed in every corner of this House. I must also compliment the honourable members for Beverley and Holderness and Brecon and Radshire for their speeches today. The member for Beverley and Holderness was a well-respected chair of the Education Select Committee when he described the then Education Secretary's reforms as ill-conceived and incoherent. You'll be relieved to hear that his speech was neither of those things. And in my opinion, he is neither an old duffer nor a young thruster, but far more valuable than either of those, a member with an independent mind, Whip's office dream. And his mention of a royal commission to deal with political wrongdoing has given me an interesting idea that I think we should take up with ministers. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, we are all servants of the Crown, but the member for Brecon and Radnorshire has taken that further than most when she worked for the Prince of Wales as a researcher. I'm not sure if she was consulted by His Royal Highness for today's gracious speech, but her speech was an interesting insight into the complex relationships between Conservative MPs, and I thank her for that. Madam Deputy Speaker, this should have been a cost of living Queen's speech. Families and pensioners across the United Kingdom are facing the biggest squeeze on household budgets and living standards at any time during Her Majesty's whole long reign, going back to the 1950s. Yet the government's programme offered nothing. Now, there was a hint in the Prime Minister's speech, I don't know if you caught it. He said that there was going to be some measures brought forward by himself and the Chancellor in the next few days. Yet the press are reporting that the Treasury are saying they have no idea what the Prime Minister is referring to. So it would be wonderful if at least a minister from the front bench could enlighten the House, because our constituents need some help and there is nothing in this Queen's speech. When inflation is at 7% and rising, its highest rate in 30 years, predicted to get into double digits by the end of this year. And we've all heard from many constituents heart-rending stories about the sacrifices they are making just to try to make ends meet because of inflation. Parents going without meals to make sure there's enough food for their children. Pensioners huddled in only one room to keep their heating bills down. Families who've seen energy bills soar by £700 already and are now told to expect another £800 rise in the autumn. People desperately need more help from the government. But what have they received instead, Madam Deputy Speaker? Tax rises, broken election promises on pension rises, and wages rising far slower than inflation. Madam Deputy Speaker, the government's unfair tax rises could not have come at a worst possible time. And the government's rise in national insurance contributions, coupled with the freezing of income tax thresholds that they like us to forget, together they are hitting the low-paid really hard. When everyone really needs, what everyone really needs is an emergency tax cut. And that's why Liberal Democrats want an immediate cut in VAT. Our VAT cut idea would help everyone, would help small businesses and high streets, and would cut inflation. Yet by failing to cut VAT, and by choosing to make the cost of living emergency worse, this government has confirmed people's deep fears that they are government that just doesn't care.
Given the increase which is now reported in Treasury receipts due to inflation and due to the increased VAT receipts, does he not think it would be appropriate for the government to take that action? But does he also recognise that in doing so, VAT reductions could not apply in Northern Ireland, and people in Northern Ireland could not benefit from it because of the Northern Ireland Protocol?
Well, I hope the government will find a way of working with politicians in Northern Ireland to help people who are struggling. But he's absolutely right about the VAT point, Madam Deputy Speaker. The chance of getting £9 billion extra in VAT this receipts, over the prediction in the budget, £38 billion. And yet they say they can't afford a VAT cut. It's clearly nonsense. And at the local elections last week, people across the country rose up to say enough is enough. From Stockport to Somerset, Cumbria to Cambridgeshire, Harrogate to Harpenden, voters chose Liberal Democrats to be their local champions to fight for a fair deal for them and their communities. And for Liberal Democrats, that fair deal must start with real action to tackle soaring energy bills and rising food prices. And not just a VAT cut. We want to increase and extend the Warm Homes discount to help over 7 million people with their heating bills. And increase the winter fuel allowance to help pensioners betrayed by the Conservatives breaking their election promise on the pensions triple lock. Liberal Democrats want to help families and pensioners in rural areas who heat their home with heating oil or LPG who aren't protected by the energy price cap. We will pay for this with a windfall tax on the super profits of the oil and gas companies. Only last week, we learned that BP and Shell are now raking in £1 billion in profit between them every single week from the same soaring gas and petrol prices that are making families suffer so much. Surely even this government can see in this economic crisis we need to cut taxes for families by asking these corporate giants to pay a little bit more. This government is failing so many groups. There's nothing to back British farmers, for example, who are at once some of the hardest hit victims of the cost of living crisis and yet crucial to solving food inflation for the rest of us. Yet instead of backing our farmers and our rural communities, the government is adding to their pain, selling them down the river with trade deals that allow low-welfare foreign imports to undercut responsible British farmers, and cutting the payments farmers rely on, costing some of them up to half of their entire income. Quite simply, that risks driving many small farmers out of business altogether. In the southwest alone, farmers will lose almost £1 billion by the end of 2027 as a result of these Conservative policies. Madam Deputy Speaker, this government's programme not only fails to help people with the cost of living emergency, it also fails to address the crisis in our NHS and care services. Take our ambulance services. Many are in crisis. Resources have been slashed, and paramedics and handlers are not being given the support they need. In the southwest, if you're a stroke victim, you now have to wait almost 2 hours for an ambulance. That is a terrifying statistic. An average wait for an ambulance of almost 2 hours. And it's not just stroke victims. In Devon, an 88-year-old man, Derek Painter, lay in, and I quote, excruciating pain after he fell on the stairs. He waited 7 hours for an ambulance. That is just horrific. Thousands of people are watching loved ones in agony and distress. Some have even watched them die. This is heartbreaking, and it cannot go on. Can ministers, can the Prime Minister look these families in the eye in such distressing circumstances and tell them they've got a grip on this health crisis? And it doesn't just stop at the ambulance crisis. Over years now, this government has allowed our NHS to spiral out of control. Local health services are at breaking point following the Conservative government's broken promises to recruit more GPs. People are struggling to get appointments, and GPs are under more pressure than ever. And then there's the ticking time bomb of NHS dentistry, or the lack of it, forcing people to shell out hundreds, if not thousands, of pounds for private work because they cannot get to see an NHS dentist. There was nothing in the Queen's speech to tackle these health crises, and nothing for the social care crisis either. Last year, the government promised to reform social care, but all we got instead was an unfair tax hike. More than 1 million people are missing out on the care they need right now, and still the government is doing nothing to help. Nor is it doing anything to support the millions of unpaid family carers who are making big sacrifices to look after their families, their loved ones. They're already facing serious financial hardship. That was before the cost of living crisis struck. And they're now being pushed to breaking point. And they were, once again, forgotten in the Queen's speech. I've told ministers, I've told the Prime Minister on countless occasions about the everyday struggles carers face. The amazing Kingston Carers Network in my constituency tell me their members, like carers across the country, are desperate for a rising carers allowance and for respite services to give them a break. Yet even the government's promise of a week unpaid leave for carers, surely the very least the government can do, was missing from the gracious speech. It's just not good enough. Without these unpaid carers, these family carers, our health and social care systems would crumble. The government is ignoring them at their peril. Nor can it afford, Madam Deputy Speaker, to ignore the growing public anger about raw sewage being dumped into our rivers and seas. I see it in the Hogsmill River in my constituency, Kingston's blue jewel, and one of only 210 chalk streams in the world. Sewage pollution is killing these rivers and chalk streams and threatens the habitats of countless wild animals and soils the beauty of our precious local environment. I know other members across the country are seeing the same, with sewage being poured into their local rivers and streams and into the seas along our coasts, whether in Eastbourne or East Devon. Liberal Democrats have proposed tough new laws and a new sewage tax on water companies to end the dumping of raw sewage. and our constituents will not forget the government's failure to listen and include such measures in the Queen's speech today. I'm happy to go.
I'm very pleased he's raised the issue of sewage in our rivers and pollution. Does he not think the solution is to take all of our water companies back into public ownership and stop pouring millions of pounds of our water costs into the profits of the private sector, often